Hello everyone, welcome back. That's a rather sparky introduction for what is, I suppose, quite a serious topic, because today I'm going to look at books that look at mental illness, and particularly I'm looking at female writers from the 1990s. I'm looking at Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen and The Mighty Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel. And the reason why I picked these themes and these books are for a couple of reasons. We're seeing quite a few more books and more discussion generally in culture today about mental illness, about depression, about being more open about it and the struggles people have. And increasingly when I see the books about it, I see these a lot from male writers as well as female writers. So you having, whether it's sort of the autobiography of Ronnie O'Sullivan to works from Matt Haig, and of course being open about how their struggles are and how that affects masculinity and our notions of men being connected to their emotions, and as well as we see women writers. But what I particularly liked about these two books, and the 1990s in particular, is that it was an era where not only did we first start talking openly about mental illness, but also it became an era where women writers were at the forefront. And that could be in anything from music, from the likes of Alanis Morissette and Riot Girl acts, whether it's L7, Hole, Daisy Chainsaw, Babes in Toyland, etc. To books, whether it's Chris Krause's I Love Dick, and these two, Susanna Kaysen and Elizabeth Wurtzel. And what I particularly liked about these books is why I picked these is they had both great influence on me as a writer and in my formative years as a young woman, but they also take the subject of mental illness and discuss it very differently with very different approaches. So I felt that if this was a subject area you were interested in, but were looking for a voice or a connection that sort of resonated with you, try one of these. So let's start with this one, Susanna Kaysen, Girl Interrupted. Chances are you've heard of this book even if you haven't read it, because it was a book that was turned into a film, and Angelina Jolie won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar, I think. I never saw the film. I'm aware that there is a plot in the film, but what's interesting is there is no plot in this book, and that arc, that narrative arc, that plot, the character structure in the film was based on this book but not taken from this book, because this book is very small but it's very touching, and like I said, there isn't a plot. It is a series of scenes, because Susanna Kaysen was, though this book was published in 94-95, this book is actually set in the 1960s. When she was just 18, Susanna was committed to the McLean Psychiatric Ward in Massachusetts, which is a hospital where Sylvia Plath stayed, where Ray Charles, where John Taylor, so had a particularly illustrious list of patients. And Susanna was committed to an all-female unit there in the 1960s for about a year and a half, after only a very short discussion with her local doctor. And what this book is, it is a series of reminiscences, like I said, of fragments, scenes, incidences, events in the period of time that she spent at the hospital. What you get the impression of is that Susanna's memory isn't necessarily completely coherent of this time. It's not fully there. There are gaps. So what she's done very interestingly, Susanna has taken, she managed to get hold of her notes, her file from her time at the hospital, which is quite hard to do, so good on her. And she's taken clips from that file, sort of doctor's notes of particular incidences, particular conversations, and she's paired that up with what her memory of particular incidents, particular events, particular people who were on the ward with her at the time, and brought in a compare and contrast. There's a beauty, it's kind of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's an interesting collegiate atmosphere between the young women on this ward. They come from all walks of life and have very different reactions, sort of stimulants to their depression, very different sources for their depression and mental illness, whether it's through eating, whether it's anger, whether it's genetic, whether it's particularly incident based. And they also have different types of treatment, electroshock therapy, isolation therapy. So it gives you a real spectrum of how people struggle with it in their own different ways. But there's a lovely set of relationships, friendships might be too strong, because there's obviously quite a difficult intimacy issue with a lot of these women in this ward, but they build up a strong network between themselves that somehow get them all through. Some people don't make it all through, and of course there is tragedy in this book, but there is a great sense of togetherness. But what I particularly liked, though, was the compare and contrast that Susanna's brought in by having her notes there, because you'd think there are gaps between the two. They sort of, the same incident, two different versions, and initially you sort of lean towards the doctor's version, and you're thinking, Susanna's version is probably a little bit constructed. And then as time passes and you realise how badly the doctors were treating depression in the 1960s, you start veering back again and think Susanna's version may have been far more on the money. But this is a very elegant, touching, affecting book. There are moments of trauma, but there's a great sense of togetherness and survival that comes out of Girl Interrupted, which makes it, if it's possible, glass half full approach to mental illness. Compare that with the mighty Prozac Nation, which is glass half empty, if ever that was true. Elizabeth Wurtzel's debut was extraordinary and set the literary world on fire, basically, when this book came out in 1994. Because what's interesting about it is normally in a first book as a debut writer, you're always told two things. One, don't write a memoir. Two, don't write it in the first person. Well, Elizabeth Wurtzel burns that down to the ground. This is a fire memoir. The opening line, I hate myself and I want to die, basically sets out the emotional tone of this book all the way through. She doesn't necessarily paint herself as an anti-hero, but as a full-on antagonist. The relationship that is focused on in the book is really between her and her mum, and this book isn't set in the 60s. This book is set in the 90s as Elizabeth was writing. She talked about her struggles with depression, how her mum was struggling to get her daughter the right treatment, how she went through endless doctors, endless psychiatrists, how they were absolutely useless, and how they would use drugs almost as a crutch just to get Elizabeth through, and that she wasn't really getting any treatment, she was just surviving. She is a torrent, she is a rage, she self-sabotages her relationship, her jobs, she is envious, she is bitter, she is jealous, she talks about the friendships she makes and breaks, the jobs that she ruins, and there's a great sense of vanity in Elizabeth Wurtzel's writing, a great sense of ego. I could quote from this book almost endlessly, but what I particularly liked about it is this book has been very influential on my own writing, because this is a book on the front foot. This is a book that Susanna wants you to like her in this book. Elizabeth wants you to hate her in this book. And it's that really angry voice and being okay with anger and legitimizing her anger, and that is incredibly intoxicating and mesmeric, and I find still resonates today. And I still think this memoir is 100 times more interesting than any memoir and any book that I've read on mental illness since, because there's always a sense of when people write about mental illness and depression that they want you to like them, that they want you to feel sorry for them, that it is tragic, that it is awful, and all of that is true. All of that is true. But what I particularly liked about this book is Elizabeth was not shying away from showing just how awful it can be to live with someone who has depression, or how awful you feel when you have depression. And it doesn't matter what people say or what you do, you just want to check out. And just that battle to stay alive, and that battle just to not step off and call it a day. And this book is incredibly electric, but it's very in your face, which I liked. You may not like, but I liked it. This book has also been very influential for a lot of other writers as well, because it was such a powerful memoir, and it was unusual really to see a woman, and Elizabeth was only young when this was published, in her early 20s, and it was unusual to see a woman that aggressive and that forceful and that unapologetic in her writing, and that I think largely remains true today. I'm still looking for the next Prozac Nation. I still want to read another book by a female writer that's this aggressive. Still looking. If you find one, let me know. Yes, but if you are looking for mental illness books, this book is very warm. This book wants to burn the walls down. So take your pick. Prozac Nation, Elizabeth Wurtzel, Susanna Kaysen's Girl Interrupted.